Take a look at the iPhone 16 Pro, and now the newest iPad Pro. Do you notice anything different? Well, let's look at the bezels. Compared to the sleek edge-to-edge design of the iPhone, the iPad's borders just seem huge. It makes you wonder, why are iPad bezels so thick? Did Apple just forget to shrink them down? It's not actually that simple. There's actually some pretty technical reasons behind this, and it's not exactly about Apple being lazy. Let's start with the most obvious reason: they're actually useful. I know it sounds strange, but hear me out. When you're holding your iPad, it's a totally different experience from holding your iPhone. An iPhone is small enough to grip in one hand, so thinner bezels aren't a problem. You really don't have to worry about where your fingers are resting. But with an iPad, you're dealing with a much bigger screen, and you need a spot to hold it without accidentally tapping the screen every few seconds. Think about all the ways you can use an iPad. Whether it's gaming, reading, or drawing, you need to hold the edges securely. If the bezels were as thin as the iPhone's, you'd constantly be triggering random inputs. It would probably get really annoying, especially when you're in the middle of something important, like finishing a sketch or playing a game that requires precision. Those thick borders give you the grip space you need, making it comfortable to use for long periods of time without worrying about accidental touches. Plus, the iPad's size is a huge factor here. It's not a device you can use casually with one hand. You're holding it with both of your hands most of the time, and if the bezels were too thin, you'd struggle to even find a comfortable way to hold it at all. So yeah, while it might seem like Apple is just being lazy by leaving the bezels thick for no reason, it's actually about making sure that you can actually use the device without constantly messing up whatever you're doing. Before we get into the more technical limitations that have affected the iPad's bezels, I want to quickly ask that if you're enjoying this video so far and want to see similar content, to make sure to hit the subscribe button. The support has already been amazing on this channel, and I have a ton of more videos planned like this. But getting back to the topic of iPad bezels, most iPads are still using LCD screens. But here's the thing with these screens: they need a bit more space to function properly. You can't just squeeze it into the edge like you can with OLED screens, which are thinner and more flexible. Remember the iPhone XR? It had noticeably thicker bezels compared to the iPhone XS, all because it used an LCD display, while the XS had an OLED. The same logic applies here. LCD tech means that there has to be a little more of a border around the screen. But here's where things get interesting: the iPad Pro. The newest iPad Pros actually do have OLED screens, and yet the bezels still are pretty thick. So what's going on here? Well, it's not just about the display. There's a whole bunch of tech that needs to be put in those bezels, like the front camera and all of the sensors for Face ID. You might be asking, if Apple can slim down the iPhone bezels, even with camera sensors, why don't they just do the same for iPad? Well, one big reason is that they put all of that tech in a notch or the new dynamic island, but it allows for those thin borders around the screen. However, when it comes to an iPad, Apple's approach is different. They've kept the bezels uniform, and they've avoided adding a notch or camera cutout. Unlike the iPhone, which most people use in portrait mode, the iPad's designed to be used in any direction: portrait, landscape, upside down, you name it. So imagine if there was a notch or a cutout on one side. Every time you rotated the device, that notch would be shifting positions, and it would totally break the symmetry. The whole experience would just feel off. Now, other companies like Samsung with the Galaxy Tab S10 Ultra have experimented with this. They added a small notch for the camera, which lets them slim down the rest of the bezels. But here's the thing: that trade-off just doesn't seem to appeal to most iPad users. Having uniform bezels, even if they're thicker, just feels more natural, especially when you're rotating the device between different tasks. Plus, when you're watching videos or playing games, that even border is much less distracting and intrusive than a random cutout on the edge of the screen. But speaking of user preferences, you think that everyone would be demanding for thinner bezels, right? Surprisingly, that's not quite the case for many iPad users. A lot of people actually prefer the thicker bezels for practical reasons. As mentioned a bit ago, when you're dealing with a device as large as an iPad, having that extra border to grab onto just feels natural. Think about it. The screen is already much larger than what you would find on an iPhone. If Apple were to go for those ultra slim bezels, it might actually make the iPad harder to hold. Imagine you're using the tablet and your hand accidentally swipes the screen because you have nowhere to hold on to. It would probably be a total nightmare for most users. Now compare this to the iPhone. It's a much smaller device, designed for one-handed use most of the time. Here, thin bezels are more important since you want to get that full screen experience without distractions. Plus, iPhones are mostly used in portrait mode, where a cutout for the camera feels less disruptive. If Apple were to add a notch or a camera cutout, it would disrupt that uniform feel. But looking ahead, let's dive into the future of iPad bezels. Will they always be this thick? It's hard to say for sure, but there's definitely potential for change down the line. One of the big developments we're keeping our eyes on is the evolution of under-display camera technology. This is the kind of technology that could finally make those ultra-thin bezels a reality. Imagine a seamless edge-to-edge display with no need for notches or thicker bezels to house the Face ID or front camera sensors. It's definitely the dream for a lot of tech enthusiasts who actually prefer thinner bezels. Now, Apple isn't exactly new to pushing boundaries with display technology. We've already seen some companies like ZTE and Samsung experimenting with under-display cameras in their smartphones. But as with any early tech, the results have been a bit mixed. The biggest challenge is balancing the camera quality with the display quality. Right now, hiding a camera under the screen tends to affect the image clarity, especially in low light, and the display itself often ends up with slight distortions in the area where the camera is hidden. But if there's one thing we know about Apple, it's that they won't rush this technology until it's perfected. They've always taken their time with new innovations, waiting until they can deliver something that won't compromise on quality. We've seen this with punch hole cameras, OLED displays, and even the fact that they still haven't touched foldable phones. They don't jump into new trends until they're ready to perfect them. And that's if they even feel that they have to innovate in this aspect. Sometimes choosing not to implement a feature is actually the right decision. So could Apple eventually pull off under-display cameras for iPad? It's definitely possible, but it's not likely to happen until the technology can meet their high standards. If Apple can figure out how to integrate these sensors seamlessly without affecting user experience, we could finally see those thinner, almost bezel-less iPads that some people actually are hoping for. With under-display sensors, Apple wouldn't have to sacrifice any of the iPad's current features. Face ID and the front-facing cameras could still exist without needing thick borders around the screen. It would open the door to some truly edge-to-edge displays, giving you more of an immersive experience for consuming content. But for now, it's still a waiting game. Apple's focus has always been on getting the tech right, not just getting it first. With the only current solution being a cutout for the camera sensors, like on the Galaxy Tab, there just doesn't seem to be a strong demand for that compromise on the iPad. It might be easy to criticize Apple for sticking with those bezels on the iPad, but there's really a lot more to it than just aesthetics. The design choices have a practical purpose too, providing a more comfortable grip, containing essential components like camera sensors, and ensuring a seamless user experience when you're holding the device in any orientation. And let's not forget that the iPad is meant to be used for more than quick scrolling. It's a versatile tool that can be used by anyone. As we've said, many users actually appreciate those bezels because they allow for better handling, especially when you're working on something a bit more demanding. As this technology evolves, it'll be interesting to see if Apple will innovate further. Will we see thinner bezels with under-display cameras one day? Only time will tell. But for now, those thick bezels are here to stay, and they serve a purpose that many users just can't ignore. But what do you think? Would you prefer slimmer bezels, or do you find the current design to be just fine?